All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 30, Section 2, Coming Apart, Coming Together. So we already kind of talked about this coming apart in previous chapters, whether that was the Vietnam War, whether that was the counterculture, or if it was the rise of various, what we might call identity politics movements. Right, identity movements in the United States. But by the 1970s, certainly by 1972 election, it seems at least the United States has kind of come together a little bit, and that is behind Richard Nixon, at least on the surface in terms of voting. Politically speaking, the Democratic Party, had relied heavily on what was called the New Deal Coalition, which was named after the president who initiated the New Deal, FDR. And the people that voted for him, at the time, Franklin Roosevelt had won one of the largest landslide victories in U.S. presidential history. And he was able to do that by creating this coalition called the New Deal Coalition, which included Southerners, plus, we might say workers or unions. All right, that was a big part of it. Plus minorities. African Americans, other minorities also voted for Roosevelt. This New Deal coalition is, to say the least, gone by the 1960s and 1970s. Issues related to civil rights have sort of isolated, specifically Southerners, away from the Democratic Party. Although workers and unions do cast their ballot, for the Democratic Party, other issues related to the New Left are now kind of becoming more important. Issues related to civil rights, issues related to poverty, issues related to the environment are becoming much more of concern. In 1964, though, before Richard Nixon ran for president, Barry Goldwater, he ran as the Republican against LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in 1964 and lost. But he pioneered kind of what we might call a new conservatism. He is in some cases kind of like the philosophical founder of what we might call a new conservative, which we'll talk about a little bit later, especially in the 1980s. He lost pretty badly to Johnson. Johnson was the, coming off of replacing John F. Kennedy after he was assassinated, and so Americans pretty much unanimously voted for Johnson in the 1964 election. That let him do his Great Society programs. It let him escalate the war in Vietnam. It let him, tackle civil rights, sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But you already had kind of these new ideas which would go on to influence the 1980s. Influence Nixon to a little bit. He's not an ideologue like, a lot of the politicians of the era, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in 1968, the 1968 election, as we know, LBJ decided not to run for re-election, and that was because of the Vietnam War. We covered this in a previous chapter. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was committed to the Vietnam War. After the Tet Offensive, most of the American public came to recognize that it was time to get out of Vietnam, and because Johnson was so committed, he simply opted not to run in the 1968 election. Who challenged him was not Barry Goldwater, but rather Richard Nixon, right? So Richard Nixon is the Republican in the 1968 election. We'll talk about who the Democrats are in a second. But Nixon was, above all, a master politician. The Southern strategy was a strategy to gain what we might call gain Southern voters who left the Democratic Party. Right, that's the Southern strategy. So this constituency that was previously part of the New Deal coalition under FDR and the Democrats, because LBJ passed civil rights legislation, this constituency is looking for somebody else to vote for, typically voting third party. Richard Nixon is going to court them by suggesting things like slowing down the process of desegregation, not making it take place as rapidly as it did before. Richard Nixon called upon the silent majority. This would be what we call Richard Nixon's voting base. He said, look, on television you see a very vocal minority, but out there in the American public, there is a silent majority of people that are ready to establish law and order. Richard Nixon ran himself in the 1968 election as the candidate that's going to restore law and order, restore a lot of the turbulence of the 1960s and kind of hearkening back to the good old days of the 1950s, so to speak. Richard Nixon was against the Great Society, says that it was wasteful, and advocated an exit to the Vietnam War, or at least an ending to it, which most Americans actually agreed with. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, like we said, LBJ is not running, so who are the Democrats going to run in the 1968 election? Well, they're all over the place, right? The Democratic Party is in disarray. Eugene McCarthy courts the anti-war vote or the anti-Vietnam War vote. Herbert Humphrey is going to really court the blue-collar workers. This is what we might call kind of that New Deal coalition, right? That's kind of the old, what we might call, quote-unquote, the old left, even though that doesn't exist. And then you have Robert Kennedy running for office, the brother of the slain president, has the star power, has the name brand recognition. A lot of Catholics are voting for him. African Americans are voting for him because of his stance on the civil rights. He's also against the war, so he's also part of this new left as well as Eugene McCarthy. And it's a very tight contested presidential primary when in 1968 Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated, only further sending this into disarray. So the both brothers, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, both assassinated. John F. Kennedy assassinated in 1963 as president. Robert Kennedy assassinated running for president and looking pretty poised to win the nomination, was assassinated in Los Angeles by someone who opposed American support of Israel in the Middle East. That's what his assassin's motive was. Meanwhile, the Dixiecrats, these are the Southern Democrats, are, kind of keeping an eye on Richard Nixon. Nixon being the politician, he's looking to try and court some of those voters, but they go more or less for a third-party candidate, George Wallace, who is, of course, known for his stance on segregation. Segregation forever is Wallace's slogan. And during the 1968 election, that third party of George Wallace actually wins a handful of states. It's one of the kind of rare times in American history when a third party does okay. You also have more radical parts of the Democratic Party, the yippies as they're called. They're like anarchists, which are much more radical. And all of this disarray between these different factions of the Democratic Party, your blue-collar workers, your anti-war workers, your old Dixiecrats who oppose civil rights, those who are in favor of civil rights, all comes to a fruition at the Chicago Democratic National Convention in 1968, where that was a site of a major riot, riot of people, but also a riot, what was called a police riot. The National Guard was called in and clashed with the crowd there. And so when that election was held, 1968, eventually the nomination, I want to say landed on Hubert Humphrey, was eventually the Democratic nominee, even though he didn't win a majority of the primary vote. In 1968, Nixon wins as the Republican law and order candidate. And in some senses, Nixon at home domestically, when it came to domestic policies, Nixon did what we say politically expedient. he didn't have a strong ideology. That's why we don't really, it's kind of hard to fit Richard Nixon into this box here of kind of this new conservatism because, in terms of his domestic policies, he kind of just does whatever will get him the most number of votes. He doesn't really have a principled stance on these things. So a good example are these two conflicting policies here. Slowing down desegregation. We obviously know what that is. That is, the ending of the Jim Crow South. And so, for example, because of Brown v. Board, schools were forced to integrate. Whites and black students could go to the same schools now. But Richard Nixon, to court Southern voters, said, we'll slow it down, right? We'll let states kind of go at their own pace. But also Nixon was the first president to affirm or to approve of a federal affirmative action policy. Affirmative action, gave additional opportunities to minorities and women in various institutions. This was in employment. So, for example, some of the some industries that worked for the U.S. government were required to hit certain quotas. So, if you were, if you were a business that was contracted by the government, so if the government hired a business in order to do whatever job that was necessary, affirmative action policy stated that those businesses had to hire a certain percentage of women, a certain percentage of African Americans, and that was a way of giving additional opportunities for those disaffected groups. And this was the complete opposite of what you might expect from a president who at the same time was slowing down desegregation, but it was whatever made him popular. Nixon was also a fan of new federalism, that is to give more power to the states. Really ever since Franklin Roosevelt, more and more power was going to the federal government. Richard Nixon restored some of the power towards the states, but perhaps the most pressing or most urgent crisis during Nixon's presidency was the state of the economy. Stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation, very difficult to tackle. That pretty much, if we looked at the American economy, ever since World War II, right, then you go from the 1950s, 1960s, now you get into the 1970s, the U.S. economy more or less had been up and up and up and up and up and up, and then finally in the 1970s it decides to take a downturn. It really hadn't been since the Great Depression that the U.S. had had a major economic downturn. And so when the economic crisis of the 1970s hits, it proves to be a very difficult task to handle. Richard Nixon does it by removing the US dollar from the gold standard. So that's remove, which allows for more money to be in circulation, right, as a remedy. But still, this problem of stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation continues on really until the end of the 1970s. The 1970s are not really remembered as a particularly prosperous economic period. This was also in part due to some geopolitics. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries really disapproved of U.S. support of Israel. Israel was a democratic, capitalist, Jewish state created in the Middle East after World War II. Many of the surrounding Arab Muslim populations really came to oppose it in those ensuing years. It was the focal point for a lot of conflict, really stemming all the way back from 1948 when Israel was created, all the way until today. And because it was such a vital Cold War ally for the United States, the nations that made up the Arab petroleum exporting countries, which produced a lot of the world's oil, refused to sell it to the United States. So the embargo was refuse to sell oil to the U.S. because of U.S. support for Israel. That greatly hampered the U.S. economy. You can probably barely see it right here, but this sign says, "Sorry, no gasoline." Here is a sign also of what they call the energy crisis. This is sometimes called. that, if the gas station has a green flag, it's welcome. Yellow flag, that means there's ration. And a red flag at the gas station means there's no gas. And there were instances in the 1970s where, people would go to the gas station, there simply just wouldn't be any there. Nixon also was somebody who continued to fund the space race, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. John F. Kennedy, when he was inaugurated in 1960, made the promise that the U.S. would land a man on the moon in the next 10 years. The moon landing happened in 1969 under the presidency of Richard Nixon, and I believe he actually even talked to the astronauts that were on the moon. However, where Nixon really shined was foreign policy. That's what he was most concerned with. Domestic policy was more about doing what made you popular. Nixon wanted to battle the Cold War. Nixon, or the Nixon Doctrine, his approach, well, we might call it maybe more flexible. Nixon's approach was also to rely more on allies in the Cold War. In other words, the United States would no longer take sole responsibility for fighting communism everywhere and anywhere at once. One of the things that Vietnam proved is kind of the limit of America's power overseas. And Nixon was a believer in that, the United States still needs to fight communism, but it also needs to rely on its allies and can't do everything by itself. Nixon also exploited what he called the China card. That was the what we call a Sino. Sino means Chinese. Soviet split. Both the Soviet Union and China were communist nations, but the two had a lot of disagreements. And so Richard Nixon became the first president to establish diplomacy, and even visited China. And I'm not talking about China, just the, the geography, but communist China. Ever since that government took over in 1949, he met with Mao Zedong, which was the communist leader of China. And generally speaking, in terms of the Cold War, Nixon favored what he called detente policy. Detente means kind of to relax, that is to ease the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. Recall John F. Kennedy's brinksmanship, right? Neither side willing to back down. Lyndon Johnson's escalation in Vietnam. Again, kind of a very hard-line approach towards the Cold War. Richard Nixon, relax, right? Let some air out of the bag, or some steam out of the pot, so to speak. Nothing signifies this. We'll talk about this next chapter, but what Nixon does in Vietnam is a good example of this, but also another strategic arms limitation treaty, or SALT treaty, with the Soviet Union that overall decreased the amount of nuclear weapons between the Soviets and the Americans.